Reinvigorating, being joined by my co-host Ryan Rosenthal, and we are so delighted to be joined by Michèle Flournoy, who served as the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy between 2009 and 2012, and at the time was the highest-ranking woman in the Defense Department. Prior to that, she served in the Defense Department during the Clinton administration and was awarded the Secretary of Defense Medal for Outstanding Public Service, the DoD Medal for Distinguished Public Service, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff's Joint Distinguished Civilian Service Award. Outside of government, Michèle has continued to make an impact on foreign policy discourse, co-founding the Center for a New American Security, and she is also the co-founder and managing partner of WestExec Advisors. So Michèle, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's great to be with you.
So Michèle, for our audience who may not necessarily be as familiar with your former position, can you tell us a bit more about what your duties were as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy?
Sure. So the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy really has a few different jobs. The first is to advise the Secretary of Defense and support him or her in their role in the National Security Council. So you represent the department at the Deputies Committee, which is the interagency body that does a lot of the options development for the National Security Council and the President. In addition, the job is supporting the Secretary in all of his or her international engagements. So whether it's traveling to other countries or receiving counterpart ministers in the Pentagon, supporting all of the work that goes into those engagements with allies and partners. And then lastly, the job is very critical to helping the Secretary exercise his or her civilian oversight of military plans, strategy development, and operations. So it's a great job. And oh, by the way, you also have oversight of 3 different defense agencies while you're at it, and managing a very large staff. So it was a fantastic job and very multidimensional within the department.
And so, Michèle, a huge portion of that is developing a defense policy across a wide variety of issues and areas and regions. And so we have the National Defense Strategy that is essentially a roadmap for the DoD and the administration's defense policy writ large. It's slotted to be released in 2022 by the Biden administration. And so how would you characterize the Biden administration's defense policy? Is there a central theme that you see that the president and his team are kind of constructing?
Yes, I do. I think they're going to put out a strategy that really places emphasis first and foremost on a rising and more aggressive China as a strategic competitor and the sort of pacing threat in terms of defense planning for deterrence and posture in the region and so forth. So that's the first thing. It will certainly acknowledge other challenges like a revisionist Russia under Vladimir Putin, a North Korea that continues to develop its nuclear weapons arsenal, and Iran that's seeking nuclear weapons and supporting terrorism throughout the Middle East. I think it'll also put more emphasis maybe than the past administration on a number of transnational threats, looking at climate change as a national security problem, looking at future pandemics as a problem we have to contend with, things like nonproliferation and so forth. So I think it's going to be both, there's going to be some areas of continuity from the Trump administration and past administrations, and there'll be some areas of differentiation or different, some things that are new.
So in terms of its foreign policy and defense policy, President Biden has often talked about re-emphasizing multilateralism and a reassertion of U.S. leadership in engaging with these key security issues, as you mentioned. However, many critics have asserted that the Afghanistan withdrawal and tensions between the U.S. and France over the AUKUS submarine deal have somewhat contravened this goal. I mean, what's your take on this?
So I do think that the Biden administration has come in with the belief that foreign policy has to be rooted in 2 things. One is strengthening our foundations here at home, whether it's turning the corner on COVID, investing in the drivers of American competitiveness, like the infrastructure bill that just passed and so forth. The second key foundation is reinvigorating our allies and partnerships. This is an area of huge strategic advantage for the United States. No other great power has this network of alliances and partners of like-minded states. So I do think that's a foundational piece. I think the way in which the Afghan withdrawal was executed was certainly bumpier than it needed to be, more problematic than it needed to be, and it did ruffle, some feathers with allies. NATO has this policy of in together, out together, and the out together wasn't as together as it probably should have been. And then I think AUKUS is a different situation. I think President Biden has said, it was not handled as well as it could have been in terms of engagement with the French, but I also don't think it will be a lasting breach in the relationship. The US and France have too much in common in terms of our interests and our values and what we're trying to do in the world. And I'm pretty sure that that relationship will recover quickly.
So, Michèle, I'm curious what your thoughts are about our engagement with other partners around the world, and that maybe some atypical defense partners, whether you look at the Philippines or maybe India, who is largely neutral or attempts to be neutral. So these other key partners in this strategic competition with China that may be really pivotal countries, how do they play in? And has the Biden administration done a good job in approaching them and trying to find areas of cooperation?
Actually, I think this has been a source of strength so far. The Biden administration, and to be fair, the Trump administration also has reinvigorated this grouping called the Quad, the US, Japan, Australia, and India. And, I think this is a really important coordination body, not only in security terms, in terms of coordinating military posture and exercises and investments, but very importantly, it's turned out on dealing with COVID, on dealing with climate change, on dealing with trade and economic issues. So, you're never going to see a NATO type alliance in Asia because that's just not the right model, given the way Asia, the geopolitics of Asia. But I think some of these groupings like the Quad can be very, very powerful in helping the major states align some of their policies when their interests align. So I give great credit to both administrations for pursuing that. And then, the other key piece will be really engaging the ASEAN states, who are absolutely critical to pushing back on some of China's worst behaviors, but also to supporting an Indo-Pacific that remains, free and fair and rules-based and respectful of international law. They are natural allies and partners, and we should be doing everything we can to cultivate those relationships as well.
So you did mention the Quad, and you did say that an Asian type NATO would not necessarily be the right structure because it just doesn't work for the Indo-Pacific. But within the Quad, do you sort of think that a more formal alliance between the United States and India is at all possible, especially when we're considering India's shifts between autonomy and alignment? And then I guess some of India's more aligning interests with the US, at least with regards to China and Chinese tensions that have been growing in recent years.
Yeah, I think there's a tremendous potential for the U.S. strategic relationship with India. Whether we ever become formal allies, probably not, just given India's tradition of non-alignment. But what I have seen in recent years is as a result of Chinese aggression, the very brutal cross-border attacks that China initiated against Indian forces in their mountainous border region. That has really pushed India into the arms of the Quad, if you will, and the United States in particular. And so I think the opportunity to cooperate on security and defense issues is greater than ever with India, and should be pursued. They have tremendous capacity to really underwrite security and stability particularly in the Indian Ocean region.
So, Michèle, I want to take a step back and kind of frame the China conversation and just really have a conversation about U.S. China competition and give our listeners maybe an understanding about how you approach it. And so, A lot of analysts and thinkers are saying that we're in a Cold War with China. A lot of people have said the exact opposite, that it's nowhere near a Cold War, or maybe it's just some geopolitical competition, strategic competition, as the DoD has now defined it. How do you characterize the U.S.-China relationship or this competitive environment we find ourselves in?
I don't think the Cold War frame is all that helpful, and it may lead us down some kind of rabbit holes because China is a growing and enormous and highly integrated economy on the world stage. It's got a totally different history and outlook than the Soviet Union did. So it's just not a helpful comparison. I do think we are in a new period with China. For the longest time, including when I first came into office, China was sort of in its what we call the hide and bide period. We're just a little old developing country over here trying to, develop and bring our people out of policy. Don't worry about us. We have no aggressive intent. We have no, great power ambitions. We're just minding our own business. And then, I think by the time Xi Jinping came in and they started militarizing islands in the South China Sea and really being much more aggressive in how they posture and use their military and law enforcement forces in the region, it became quite clear that China really does have aspirations to become the dominant power in the region, and to unilaterally change the status quo. And it became clear that they're not bought into the rules of the road that were negotiated after World War II and have created a lot of stability and prosperity in the region. So we do have a serious competition now with China. That there are security dimensions, there are economic dimensions, technological dimensions, and I think even ideological dimensions. As you hear China talk about the failings of democracy and the superiority of the authoritarian model that they've constructed, the communist model in China. So that said, we have some areas where it's absolutely essential for us to cooperate. Climate change being first and foremost, but also managing or trying to constrain nuclear proliferation in places like North Korea and Iran. I would hope, thinking about, can we compare notes on this pandemic so that we do a better job of preventing or dealing with the next one, because there will be the next one. And so, and of course, given that we're two nuclear powers, we want to make sure that competition does not escalate into conflict. And so there's a lot of work to be done here, but we have to be clear-eyed and also balanced in our approach. I personally think that one of the key areas of focus needs to be on deterrence. I think that at a time when the narrative in Beijing is one of U.S. decline, they're sort of counting us down and out, and they're feeling their oats and feeling, like they're on the rise. This is their time. That sets the stage for the potential of miscalculation, where they would use force thinking that we wouldn't respond or we wouldn't respond effectively, and we could end up in a crisis that neither side really wanted.
I do want to touch on those questions around deterrence, but before that, I sort of want to go back to what you said about the hide and bide policy, just for our listeners. As you said, again, China was sort of hiding and sort of building up their own power during the 1980s under Deng Xiaoping. Michèle, when do you think the hide and bide period sort of officially ended? Is it more of that Xi Jinping individually is sort of taking China into a more assertive direction, or did we see the roots of this during, say, Hu Jintao, his predecessor's time as president as well?
I think it lasted pretty much through the Hu period. The first term of the Obama administration, we were all about engagement. As the Bush administration before us had been, the theory was if you engage China enough, if you bring them into institutions like the World Trade Organization and other multilateral frameworks, they will become a responsible stakeholder. They will have so much stake in the international order as a rising power that, they'll accept the rules, they'll abide by the norms. And there was some early indications that that might be possible. But I think particularly with the transition to Xi, where you had situations where, she literally sat down with President Obama, looked him in the eye and said, you don't have to worry about these islands that we're building. They will never, ever be militarized. That is not our intent. And then 2 years later, they're building bases and putting air defenses and missiles on the island. So that was sort of a moment where I think a lot of folks in the administration and elsewhere said, okay, this is the moment when the veil is being dropped and they're taking actions that are really showing their true intent and ambition. And then if you look at Xi's rhetoric and how much more assertive, if not aggressive, it has become over time, I think it's pretty clear that the shift has happened with him. There may have been some early indications, or parts of the Chinese regime, like the PLA, who never were never were that bought into the hide and bide policy. But I think if you had to put it in as a point in time, I would say it was the transition to Xi, and once he felt that he had consolidated enough power that he was ready to move forward. I would just add, there is a debate about whether Xi moved too quickly, whether he dropped the veil too quickly and signaled aggressive intent and through various actions, and has a sort of awakened the international community, the U.S., the Quad, and others, and have, whether he's inadvertently alarmed the rest of the world about China's intention and that he was premature in doing that. Because I think there is a lot of pushback now, a lot of efforts to counterbalance the worst of China's behavior right now.
So, Michèle, I want to return to deterrence. And we had Admiral Stavridis on the podcast to talk about his book, 2034. And that book, was eye-opening. Of course, it's fiction, but it talks about things that we do right now. Freedom of navigation operations are regularly occurring, and that could, of course, be spiraled out into a hot conflict, but that is a mechanism of deterrence, at least in my eyes. And so how do we strike the correct balance to ensure that we have an appropriate level of deterrence, but also don't open ourselves up to basically sleepwalking into a conflict with China?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think the first component of deterrence is communicating resolve. You've got to show up, you've got to be consistent in expressing or defining your interests and communicating what you will defend. The second is in demonstrating capability. And here, what we want to be able to do is convince the Chinese, or at least sow enough doubt in their minds that they might hesitate, that either we can be successful in denying the success of any aggression they might undertake, or we could impose such costs that it would really not be worth it for them in the end. And so that requires demonstrating capability, being consistent in your posture and your messaging and your signaling, both words and deeds. But as you say, you've got to walk a line so as you're not so sort of overly provocative, or that you actually trigger a reaction that you were trying to deter in the first place. So it has to be very carefully thought through and sequenced and communicated. And this is where I think the U.S. needs to do a lot more work, because, a lot of what you see in the military budget is making bets on technologies and capabilities that in 10 to 15 years will dramatically improve deterrence. But we also have a near to midterm problem before those things are ready. And that requires us to think in new ways about how we use what we have right now in hand to do a better job of giving the Chinese pause in terms of, hey, today's not a good day to launch aggression against Taiwan, or, pick your target.
So, Michèle, in a recent article, I think earlier this year, you said that Taiwan in particular is the flashpoint for U.S. China relations. So what in particular makes this current moment in the U.S. Taiwan China triangle, what makes that different right now from the past 70 years of history?
So I think the first thing I would say is Xi Jinping has made it very clear that he wants to be the Chinese leader who reunifies China. We've seen him make very strong moves against Hong Kong. And I think as he's watched the international response, it's unfortunately made him feel like, hey, well, that wasn't too bad. I can keep going, and I didn't pay a very high price for that. I think we're in a period in the very near term where any kind of move against Taiwan is unlikely. I think Xi is focused on having a stable environment for the Olympics that are coming up. He's focused on a stable period, creating stability in the run up to the 20th Party Congress, where he hopes to certainly get a third term, if not president for life. So it's a period of where he wants to be careful and build his strength. I think where I start to worry is after 2022, into 2023, if Xi really feels like he's got his power base consolidated, he starts to look to, okay, how am I going to create my legacy? Even then, I think the Chinese preferred approach to Taiwan is not military. It is to use overwhelming political isolation, coercion, economic entanglement, sort of a Star Trek, absorb them into the Borg strategy. That's the preferred approach. But I think at the end of the day, if she felt that that was not enough, or if there was a crisis prompted by Taiwan, a future Taiwanese leader declaring independence unilaterally, you could see a military crisis with Taiwan. And at that point, that's when we need to be very clear that we and the international community would not allow might to make right, would not allow Taiwan to be taken by force.
So I'm curious about Taiwan in that respect. When we look at Taiwan's capabilities, their defense, I imagine that it would be very difficult for Taiwan to defend itself, which is why having partners and allies essentially is so crucial. And so what else needs to be done? Because the U.S. has, security assistance. We've just sent reporting came to light that U.S. advisors, military advisors are on the ground in Taiwan. And so while there is this kind of ambiguity as far as the U.S. defense, whether or not that's a credible commitment or not, what else needs to be done to ensure that we demonstrate to China, not just the United States, but other key Western allies, that it's a red line for us?
Well, I do think we need to make sure that our security assistance and cooperation with Taiwan is really focused not just on shiny objects, but on the capabilities that will actually buy them time. There's no way they could defend themselves by themselves against an all-out attack by China, but we need to make sure that they have enough that they can buy time for the U.S. and allies and international community to respond. So that's thing one. Thing two is we need to do a much better job of assessing, what would be most meaningful in terms of what can we hold at risk? What does China value that we can hold at risk? And it may or may not be directly related to a Taiwan intervention, but there are some analysts at RAND and elsewhere who've said, if we could demonstrate the capability to hold the entire Chinese naval fleet at risk within a finite period of time, then the question for the Chinese is, are you willing to lose your entire navy to try to attack Taiwan? That's a dilemma. That's the kind of dilemma you want to create that says, well, maybe the costs aren't worth, maybe I should, wait a little longer and see if I can get to this objective a different way, or I can negotiate or whatever. So it's really about preparing those kinds of deterrence options based on what we understand China values the most. And they don't have to be symmetric. They can be asymmetric. I also think it's very important to have some kind of dialogue with China about where we think they could miscalculate and to try to create some guardrails. And I'll give you an example. So Chinese military doctrine talks about systems destruction warfare, and they envision very early and large-scale cyber attacks on the United States around military bases, to try to prevent our forces from being able to project power into the region and reinforce Taiwan or whoever. They also envision early space attacks. But I'll take the cyber one for an example. I would love for the United States to have a conversation with the Chinese to say, look, think this through. Your assumption is that these cyber attacks are going to create chaos in the US and break our will. And so we won't respond. But think about it. If you attack the electrical grids around US military bases, you're almost certainly going to take down electricity at hospitals, and American civilians are going to die. Now, that is not going to keep an American president out of a conflict. That is going to almost force him or her to get even more engaged. It's going to be escalatory, not deterring. And so those are the kinds of conversations that I would hope someone somewhere will have at some point, because they really are making some very bad assumptions about how the US will respond. And they could inadvertently escalate a situation when they're trying to deter us from entering into it in the first place.
So when we look at the Taiwanese military, we saw those reports that the Taiwanese president confirmed that US troops were in fact training Taiwanese forces on the island itself. But also, I mean, in your view, is the Taiwanese military doing what it needs to prepare for Chinese aggression, but also are they focusing on the right things? Because sometimes we think about the Taiwanese military perhaps focusing maybe a bit too much on conventional weapons, conventional tactics, and so on. Should they be turning to, say, non-conventional tactics, for example, guerrilla war fighting styles? Just because the Chinese invasion of Taiwan, I mean, in my view, would certainly sort of overcome such conventional methods.
Yeah, I am not privy to the latest focus of our training and work with the Taiwanese, but I do think they could take a page from some of the work we've done in recent years with the Baltics in terms of deterring Russia. So I had one US commander say, our work with the Baltics is really about making them look like an indigestible porcupine to the Russian bear. So how do we make Taiwan look like an indigestible porcupine to the Chinese dragon? and there's lots of different things you can do to just complicate the adversary's attack planning, make it more costly, make it more slow going, make it more difficult. And, I do think there's a lot of that kind of preparatory work that's been done in the Baltics that is, there's an analogous kind of set of things that could be done in Taiwan. I don't have a clear sense of how much we're doing that, but I do think it's very complementary to the more traditional security cooperation approaches that we've taken in the past.
So Michèle, I now want to turn to back to the Chinese military and ask about their capabilities, just because while the United States clearly has immense capabilities, we are the strongest force in the world, the Chinese capabilities are growing. I mean, the PLA has a lot of capabilities. We've seen the testing of new weapon systems that are, frankly, at least to me, very scary. And the US needs to catch up in certain areas. And so how would you kind of lay out the landscape as far as China's military capabilities? Are they attaining some sort of parity with the United States, or is it still kind of a long ways for them to go?
So I think that quantitatively, they have a huge advantage in that any scenario we can imagine will be very close to home for them and very far away for us. So that is a challenge. They also have spent a couple of decades now sort of setting the theater with rings of missiles that can reach different ranges, including many US bases, with air defenses, missile defenses of their own. And so they've really kind of prepared the space with this, within the first island chain and the second island chain, with layered defenses and systems designed to deny us access or deny us the freedom to operate in an area. So the challenge for the US is that our traditional assumptions that we go in, we establish air superiority, maritime superiority, and then we have freedom of action to conduct our operations. That's just not going to happen. We're going to have to operate in a either denied environment or a disrupted environment, meaning constant attacks on communications, on our intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance networks, on our command and control networks, and so forth. And so it takes a very different set of operational concepts to be effective in those areas. And we have to think much more asymmetrically. We have to start, instead of assuming that we're going to be in a position of strength, we have to think like the underdog and say, how are we going to counter their strengths and exploit their vulnerabilities as we approach this? When it comes to the question of technology superiority, it really depends. I think in most cases, the US still has an edge, but China in some areas is catching up quickly. And in some cases is actually, like the hypersonic system that we saw tested recently, has moved to field things faster than we have. So it's a question you can't really answer in general, but have to answer in particular. But in my mind, it's really not about just counting platforms and saying they have quantitative superiority or whatever. It's really looking at capabilities and concepts to say, who can gain advantage in a particular scenario. The one thing I will say is the Chinese military really isn't tested. It hasn't had to operate under wartime conditions, and the U.S. military has. I'm not saying that's a magic bullet, but it is a source of tremendous advantage. I also think that the way we operate is from a command and control perspective is likely to have great advantages. I think the Chinese military can be very hamstrung by sort of political officers integrated at every level. And so the kind of innovation, on ingenuity, pushing command down to the lowest level, within a general commander's intent, that kind of approach that has made the U.S. military successful in adapting to change on the ground in very rapid timeframes is something the Chinese have never really practiced or had to do in reality. So I think that is an area of advantage for the United States as well.
I now want to sort of ask you a question on Chinese military assets at ports throughout the Indo-Pacific. I mean, we've seen the concerns about ports, perhaps in Djibouti, that China controls. And then we recently saw a story, about a Chinese construction that was going on in the UAE that the US recently intervened in. And I recently did a mini series for this podcast on Sri Lanka that sort of focused on the Hambantota port. And all the Sri Lankan leaders, of course, said, no, we're not going to let China militarize it. But a recent DOD report said that, one of the countries that China would consider putting a port at is Sri Lanka, a military port. So what concerns do you have about Chinese military ports, military bases throughout the Indo-Pacific? Is it a real threat? Should we be really concerned about it? Or is this more just speculation?
I do think we need to be concerned about it. I wish we would look at the Belt and Road Initiative broadly from a much more strategic perspective. It's not something we want to imitate or match every single place in the world. That's not in our interests, and it's not within our resources. But I think we need to be clear-eyed about where we think China's trying to get a toehold for not only economic advantage and political advantage, but for military advantage. And in those areas, we need to have ways of trying to prevent that activity and also provide have some alternative offerings, if you will. And so I think that I am concerned about they call it the string of pearls, building this string of ports that go from, from the Pacific into the Indian Ocean and so forth. And that really creates potential for greater power projection on the part of the PLA and the Navy, and logistics support for them to have much more far-flung operations. So I think it is something, and not to mention the intelligence gathering problems we've seen. I mean, why are they in Djibouti? I mean, they're in Djibouti in part to be up close and personal observing us.
I mean, it's a crucial consideration. And so I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, and that is the development of our defense technologies. It's a crucial component to maintain a strategic edge. And you've been quite outspoken about your belief that the U.S. is, in many scenarios, losing the technological advantage relative to China. And so I'd love for you to kind of elaborate on this concern of yours and how you view it, because I think it's something that really should be emphasized. We've had Pete Newell and Steve Blank on the podcast to talk about defense innovation. And so your perspective would certainly be valuable.
Sure. So you see the Chinese as a matter of state policy and resource allocation, making big bets in areas like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, certainly cyber, space and counter space, hypersonics, directed energy, bio. I mean, you can go down the list. And you see the United States, where we've always been a little bit uncomfortable with the notion of industrial policy. We've been our general assumption is that the free market will place the bets in the right place, that competition will determine the right winners and losers, and so forth. And in general, I think that's true. I mean, I would never trade the U.S. innovation ecosystem for the Chinese approach. But I think we're in a period of competitiveness where the federal government needs to, first of all, very clearly articulate which are the technological areas that are most important to maintain our edge on national security, and then use federal funding and policies to create place some big bets and attract private capital to invest in those areas, to structure a series of multilateral competitions so we get the best companies into the competition, and then over time, they compete to determine who's got the best capabilities, and the winners emerge. And then most importantly is have a set of authorities and people trained and incented to use them to get those winners from the prototype, the demonstration phase, across the procurement valley of death, and into a program of record where they are actually building capability at speed and at scale. That's the key part that we're missing right now. We've gotten in pretty good at tech scouting in the Department of Defense, but we're still terrible about getting that really cutting edge prototype or new capability into the hands of the warfighter at speed and at scale. That's where we're still suffering. And part of that is that we really haven't trained and incentivized a kind of like a bunch of acquisition ninjas, or some special forces of acquisition who are schooled in how agile technology development works, who are incentivized to adopt a higher risk profile in overseeing the development of those technologies, and then really trained on how to use the more flexible authorities like OTA and others that Congress has provided to actually get those things scaled into the defense program. So there's the authorities are there, the need is there, but we haven't really incentivized the people in the system to use them to their full extent and to our advantage.
So does enhancing our, U.S. military technological advantage, does enhancing that require that we need to increase our defense budget? Because I think every time we pass a new defense budget, we always see political sort of controversies, right? Saying like, oh, why are we, increasing the defense budget? But are we sort of using current defense allocations as effectively and efficiently as we could be or should be?
I do not think we have to spend more to get to the level of innovation adoption that we need. But the big but is that only is true if Congress allows the department to divest of capabilities it no longer needs, or maybe to reduce buys of legacy systems in order to make rooms for the integration of new capabilities that will make those legacy systems effective and relevant in the new security environment. So, if you have a Congress that's willing to go along with the department as a partner in making some of these tough trade-offs, you don't need more money. You just need to spend it more wisely. If you have a Congress that won't let you cancel anything, then you'll have to do it with a more additive approach and it will cost more. So it really depends on making the case to Congress and bringing them along to make some hard trade-offs for the future.
Michèle, I just want to ask one more question on defense innovation, particularly when it comes to bringing more voices and perspectives and ideas to the table. Because for startups, it's very hard to get within the defense acquisition framework. And so do we have kind of maybe a public affairs problem, or is it more of so just the bureaucracy of the DoD is so difficult to navigate that there needs to be kind of maybe a new approach to ensuring that we can get very innovative, smaller companies, or maybe even entrepreneurs, to have an entrepreneurial model whereby we can have these great technologies and great people coming through this framework?
I think it's more of a business model problem than a communications problem. And, in my experience, there are dozens, if not hundreds, of small, innovative tech companies who want to make a contribution to the national security space. But figuring out how to do that, I mean, the department still makes it really difficult. You have to be really determined and have a set of investors who are going to give you the time to get to the kinds of return on investment, in the defense side that you might be able to see much quicker on the commercial side. So we make it much too hard. And so I think most of the work now, it's less about convincing tech companies out there that, to play and to contribute in the defense space. It's more about making the department a better buyer, reducing the barriers to entry, facilitating, companies getting across that valley of death between winning the prototype, competition and getting into an actual, program of record. I think most of that work has to be done on the department side to be a better buyer of emerging technology.
So Michèle, as we sort of round out this conversation, I want to focus on one last topic, which is cyber, the cyberspace domain. So in my view, I feel like so much of our abilities to enhance our cybersecurity, to enhance our cyber warfare capabilities are definitely rooted in the talent that we're able to get. So my question to you is, I guess, do we need to sort of redefine what our conception of the typical soldier is? And in terms of doing that, how do we compete for STEM majors, for computer science majors, for software engineers, when the private sector has done such a good job of recruiting them to these fun, dynamic workspaces at Google or Facebook or Apple and so on? How does the US defense community try and get those people and win them over from the private sector?
Yeah, the talent problem is a huge challenge, and it's not only cyber, but it's for technical talent in general, whether it's AI or hypersonics or, quantum computing or synthetic bio or cyber. I mean, and I think there's no one size fit all, but we have to diversify the pathways that someone with a technical background can use to find a way to serve. So I think we want to, there are a lot of technologists who don't want to meet the requirements of joining the military. They don't want to have to cut their hair and remove tattoos and nose rings, or, I mean, I'm being slightly facetious here, but they don't want to have to pass a PT test. It's just not relevant to what they want to contribute, right? And so I think creating some kind of civilian reserve where you could, hack for your country on the weekends, or you can serve in a support role to the military as a technologist. I think that's one pathway we need to widen. I think creating pathways for more experienced senior technical leaders to take a civic service leave from a Google or a Facebook or a Microsoft or an Apple to go in and spend a tour or two in government as a technology leader. That's something we need to figure out. We have a lot of technical acumen in the military that hasn't been developed. So there's a lot more that we need to do to find those who are already in the military and create a career path where they can actually grow and develop and be promoted and make a career as a technologist in the US military, which is lacking right now. So there's just a lot of ways that we need to go after this problem. Congress has actually given the department a lot of authorities for scholarships, fellowships, and we're not using them with speed and scale. So I think this is a really critical area to focus on in the future. And I would encourage any of your listeners out there who have a technical background and have an interest in national security to find some way to serve at some point. And it's a mission that matters. That higher purpose is very rewarding. And so I'm just a little bit of a recruitment ad there for some of your listeners.
Oh, yeah. Thank you for doing that. I mean, Andre and I don't have a technological background, but we both are looking to serve in other capacities. And so I wish I could code. There's certainly a lot of opportunities available. But when we look to the kind of structure within DoD to address cyber issues, we have this kind of dual structure approach. We have Cybercom and we have NSA, which are stood up under this umbrella together, essentially. And so they're led by General Paul Nakasone. And there have been kind of some ideas floated about maybe separating the two, of having Cybercom separate from NSA because they kind of have very different missions. And so do we need to separate those two out, or would it maybe be beneficial to take a step back and include another service branch, maybe a cyber force? Because we saw under the Trump administration the standing up of Space Force, the 6th service branch. Do we need a 7th?
I think each of the services has a program to grow cyber expertise, cyber warriors, if you will, and then those people can do tours at NSA and Cybercom and so forth. I think I'm not opposed to looking at separating NSA with a civilian leader and then a military leader for Cybercom. But I do think the real challenge right now is they're depending on the same people and same resources. And so you really need to grow. I think the more fundamental problem is you need to grow that talent pool. But even beyond that, that's just focused on the cyber support to the intelligence community on the NSA side and cyber operations on the military side. Then you have the larger problem that we've seen in spades with these ransomware attacks and other cyber attacks, is that most of our critical infrastructure is owned and operated by the private sector. So you have attacks on private entities that can create national emergencies. And so I think the bigger cyber problem for the US government is how do we ensure that we raise the standards and the capabilities of these key areas of critical infrastructure that are operated in the private sector. And that gets beyond the writ of DoD into DHS and other entities in the US government that really have that lead role.
So when we think about the years ahead, we have President Biden sort of wrapping up his first year. Many things are uncertain for the future. Are there any underappreciated emerging threats that you sort of have an eye on that you think perhaps that we're not paying too much attention to? And I mean, we've had other guests, of course, talk about domestic politics and partisanship, but sort of leaving that aside, is there just something we're not focused on that we need to be focused on as a country, whether it's a threat in a particular region or a new sort of domain and so on?
Well, unfortunately, you took away the thing I was going to say, which was, I think our domestic political polarization is starting to have real impacts on our national security in a couple of respects. One, the Biden administration's put forward over 50 nominations for ambassadors. Almost all of them have been put on hold by 2 Republican senators, Senator Cruz, Senator Hawley, who are holding these people not because they think they're unqualified for the jobs, but because they're trying to use them as negotiating chips to get concessions from the administration. So here we are, 10 months into this administration, and we talk about the importance of investing in alliances and partners and showing up and being present in the region. And all of these ambassador jobs are just empty. We don't have an ambassador to China. We don't have an ambassador to the key allied countries we've been talking about. We just got, finally, after a very long hold, our NATO ambassador confirmed. So this is causing real damage, this polarization. And I think that you can't leave it off the table. That is a very, very big threat. It also causes a problem because it feeds this narrative of U.S. decline and distraction and internal focus that Beijing is exploiting, Moscow is promulgating, and so forth. So it heightens the risk of our allies, or I'm sorry, our adversaries or competitors underestimating us and taking risks and based on miscalculation. So I have to say that first and foremost. But I guess one sleeper I would say just raise, and is something we could go to bed tonight not even thinking about this and wake up in the morning with a nuclear crisis. India and Pakistan, 3 times when they've had, usually it's provoked by a terrorist attack that's been launched from Pakistan by, non-state actors into India. And it has spiraled into a situation where the prospect of war between these two countries has become very real. They now are postured with their nuclear forces almost right up against each other. So we could go to bed tonight not even thinking about an India-Pakistan nuclear confrontation and wake up tomorrow morning and find that it's underway. And so that is one that I think is sort of a black swan or a sleeper event that I would note. And you can find probably other examples of that too. This notion of miscalculation between nuclear powers can get very dangerous very quickly.
Absolutely. We've had a lot of smart and experienced people discuss what they see as underappreciated threats. And I think that's the first time we heard India-Pakistan. And it certainly got me thinking because that certainly is, at least in my mind, underappreciated. And so, Michèle, we're going to leave it here. Thank you very much for joining us for such a wonderful conversation, really a great deep dive on U.S. China competition. We talked about the defense budget, technological innovation within DoD. We appreciate you taking the time. And of course, thank you for your service. We'll leave it there.
Thank you. And I hope that all of your listeners consider, how they can serve as well in the future. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.